I thought losing my job via a cold email was the worst thing that could happen to me. Little did I know it would lead to my boss's entire empire crumbling down. If you enjoy stories of justice served, hit that like button and subscribe for more. The notification popped up on my phone at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. I was still in bed, hair messy, wearing my favorite oversized t-shirt, when I saw the subject line that would change my life forever. Employment termination. Effective immediately. My name is Megan, and I had been working as a senior financial analyst at Pinnacle Investment Group for 3 years. The company was based in downtown Chicago, occupying 2 floors of a gleaming glass building that overlooked Lake Michigan. I loved my job there, or at least I thought I did. The work was challenging, the pay was decent, and my colleagues were mostly supportive. My boss, Richard Blackwood, was a different story entirely. Richard was the kind of man who wore $1,000 suits, but had the personality of a soggy piece of bread. He was in his late 40s, with perfectly styled gray hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. He had founded Pinnacle 15 years ago and had built it into a mid-sized investment firm managing over $200 million in client assets. From the moment I started working there, something felt off about Richard. He would have hushed phone conversations that stopped abruptly when anyone walked by. He would stay late in the office, sometimes until midnight, which seemed excessive even for someone in his position. And there were the unexplained trips to the Cayman Islands that he claimed were for client meetings, but I never saw any corresponding client files. The morning I received that email, Chicago was experiencing one of its typical gray November days. The wind was howling off the lake, and I could see pedestrians on the street below bundled up in heavy coats, heads down against the bitter cold. I sat up in bed, my heart racing as I read the email more carefully. Dear Megan Patterson, due to ongoing restructuring and budget constraints, your position at Pinnacle Investment Group has been eliminated effective immediately. Please do not report to the office. Your personal belongings will be shipped to your home address. Final paycheck and benefits information will be provided within the legally required time frame. Richard Blackwood, CEO. That was it. 3 years of my life, dismissed in 5 sentences. No phone call, no meeting, no explanation beyond budget constraints. I had been performing well, had received positive reviews, and had even been given additional responsibilities just 2 months prior. Something was very wrong. I threw on some clothes and drove to the office anyway. The security guard, Marcus, who had always been friendly to me, looked uncomfortable when I approached the front desk. "I'm sorry, Miss Patterson," he said, avoiding eye contact. "Mr. Blackwood left specific instructions that you're not to be allowed upstairs." "Marcus, this is crazy. I just want to understand what's happening." He shrugged sympathetically. "I'm just following orders, ma'am. Your box is being prepared and will be delivered this afternoon." I stood there in the marble lobby, feeling humiliated and confused. Other employees were walking past me, some offering sympathetic glances, others pretending not to see me. I felt like I was wearing a scarlet letter. That evening, when my box of personal belongings arrived, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Mixed in with my family photos and desk supplies was a flash drive that didn't belong to me. It was labeled RB Backup Files in Richard's handwriting. He must have accidentally included it when hastily packing my things. Curiosity got the better of me. I plugged the drive into my laptop, and what I found made my hands shake. The drive contained copies of client account statements, bank records, and email correspondence that painted a picture of massive financial fraud. Richard had been moving client money into offshore accounts, creating fake investment reports, and essentially running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme. One email chain particularly caught my attention. It was between Richard and someone named Viktor Petrov, discussing how to layer money through shell companies in the Cayman Islands. They were using client funds to purchase luxury properties, artwork, and even a yacht. The amounts were staggering. We're talking millions of dollars stolen from retirees, families, and small businesses who had trusted Richard with their life savings. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about Mrs. Chen, an elderly client who had invested her entire retirement with us. She would come to the office sometimes, bringing homemade cookies and talking about her grandchildren. Richard had been stealing from her, from all of them. By morning, I had made my decision. I was going to turn Richard in, but I needed to be smart about it. This wasn't just about wrongful termination anymore. This was about justice for all the people he had victimized. The next few weeks were the most stressful of my life. I couldn't tell anyone what I had discovered, not even my closest friends or family. I was terrified that Richard would somehow find out I had the evidence before I could act on it. I spent my days researching how to properly report financial crimes to federal authorities. I learned that the FBI has a specialized white-collar crime unit that handles cases like this. I also discovered that the Securities and Exchange Commission would be involved, as would the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. But I needed to be absolutely certain about what I was alleging. I couldn't just march into the FBI field office with accusations based on an accidentally discovered flash drive. I needed to understand the full scope of Richard's crimes and ensure I had interpreted the evidence correctly. I reached out to a former colleague, Jessica, who had left Pinnacle 6 months earlier to work at another firm. We met for coffee at a small shop in Lincoln Park, far from our old office. "Megan, I have to be honest with you," Jessica said, stirring her latte nervously. "I left Pinnacle because I was starting to have doubts about some of the things I was seeing. Client portfolios that didn't match their statements, discrepancies in the books that Richard would explain away with vague answers about complex investment strategies." "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. "What was I supposed to say? I had suspicions but no proof, and Richard made it clear that questioning his methods was not welcome. Remember what happened to David?" I did remember David. He had been a junior analyst who had asked too many questions about certain transactions. Richard had fired him for performance issues, but David had been one of our most thorough employees. Jessica leaned forward. "There's something else. About a week before I left, I overheard Richard on a phone call. He was angry, talking about how some clients were asking too many questions about their returns. He said something about needing to accelerate the timeline and cash out before anyone gets too curious. This information made my stomach churn. It suggested that Richard was aware his scheme was close to being discovered and was preparing to flee with the stolen money. I spent the next week organizing all the evidence I had. I created a comprehensive timeline of suspicious transactions, printed out key documents, and prepared a detailed summary of what I believed was happening. I also researched Richard's background more thoroughly and discovered that he had been investigated by state regulators in California 15 years ago for questionable business practices, though no charges had been filed. The weather was getting colder, and Chicago was preparing for its first major snowstorm of the season. I was sitting in my apartment, looking out at the gray sky, when I made the phone call that would change everything. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, Chicago Field Office. How may I direct your call?" "I need to report a financial crime," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I have evidence of securities fraud and money laundering." 2 days later, I was sitting in a sterile conference room in the FBI building, facing 2 agents who would become very familiar to me over the coming months. Agent Sarah Martinez was a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s who specialized in white-collar crime. Agent Robert Chen, no relation to our client, Mrs. Chen, was an older man with extensive experience in financial investigations. "Ms. Patterson," Agent Martinez began, "we've reviewed the materials you provided, and we want you to know that we're taking your allegations very seriously. However, we need to verify this information independently before we can proceed." I handed over copies of everything I had, keeping the original flash drive in a safety deposit box as insurance. The agents asked detailed questions about my employment, my relationship with Richard, and my knowledge of the firm's operations. "We're going to need your cooperation over the coming weeks," Agent Chen explained. "This type of investigation requires patience and careful coordination. We'll need to gather additional evidence, interview other employees, and work with financial regulators." As I left the FBI building that day, I felt a mixture of relief and terror. I had done the right thing. but I also knew that my life was about to become very complicated. The FBI investigation moved faster than I had expected. Within 2 weeks, agents had interviewed several current and former Pinnacle employees, obtained court orders for financial records, and coordinated with international law enforcement agencies to track money that had been moved offshore. I was asked to maintain my normal routine as much as possible, which was difficult considering I was unemployed and dealing with the stress of being a key witness in a federal investigation. I had started applying for new jobs, but the job market was tough, especially for someone whose most recent employment had ended abruptly. Agent Martinez called me on a snowy Thursday morning in December. "Megan, we need you to come in. There have been some developments." At the FBI office, I learned that their investigation had uncovered evidence of crimes that were far more extensive than even I had realized. Richard hadn't just been stealing from clients. He had been falsifying regulatory reports, bribing a state official to overlook compliance violations, and using the firm's resources to launder money for other criminal enterprises. "We've identified at least 43 victims," Agent Chen told me. "The total losses appear to exceed $15 million. Some of these people lost their entire life savings." The human cost of Richard's crimes was staggering. There was a couple in their 70s who had invested their retirement fund with Pinnacle and now faced the possibility of losing their home. A small business owner had invested his company's cash reserves and was now struggling to make payroll. A single mother had put money aside for her daughter's college education, money that was now gone. But the investigation was also revealing the extent of Richard's attempts to hide his crimes. He had created an elaborate network of shell companies, fake investment vehicles, and offshore accounts. He had been preparing for the possibility of discovery by gradually moving assets beyond the reach of U.S. authorities. "We believe he's planning to flee the country," Agent Martinez said. "We have intelligence suggesting he's been making preparations to relocate to a non-extradition country." This news terrified me. If Richard discovered that I was the source of the investigation, I could be in danger. The agents assured me that they were taking my safety seriously, but I still found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later. The FBI had been monitoring Richard's communications and discovered that he was planning to transfer a massive sum of money to accounts in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. The transfer was scheduled for the following Monday. "We can't let him complete this transfer," Agent Martinez explained. "Once that money is moved, it becomes much harder to recover for the victims." The agents worked with federal prosecutors to obtain emergency court orders to freeze Richard's accounts. They also coordinated with Interpol to alert international authorities about Richard's activities. On the Sunday before the planned transfer, I was at home watching the news when my phone rang. It was Agent Chen. "We're executing search warrants tomorrow morning," he said. "We'll be searching his office, his home, and several other locations. We wanted to give you a heads up because this is going to become very public very quickly." That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the moment when Richard would realize that his carefully constructed criminal empire was collapsing around him. I also worried about how he would react when he discovered that I was the one who had brought it all down. The next morning, I turned on the local news and saw reporters gathered outside the Pinnacle Investment Group building. The ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "FBI raids local investment firm in fraud investigation." My phone started ringing immediately. Friends, former colleagues, and even reporters had somehow gotten my number. I let them all go to voicemail and drove to a coffee shop across town where I could watch the news coverage in anonymity. The reporter on TV was standing in front of the building where I had worked for 3 years, describing how FBI agents had arrived with boxes and computer equipment. She mentioned that the investigation involved allegations of securities fraud and money laundering, and that the firm's assets had been frozen pending the outcome of the investigation. Then I saw Richard being led out of the building in handcuffs. Even from the grainy television footage, I could see the shock and fury on his face. He was no longer the confident, intimidating figure who had terrorized his employees. He looked like what he was, a criminal who had finally been caught. The arrest made national news. It turned out that Richard's scheme was one of the largest investment frauds in Chicago's history. and the case attracted attention from financial media outlets across the country. The FBI had not only frozen his U.S. assets, but had also worked with international authorities to seize accounts in 3 different countries. In the weeks following Richard's arrest, more victims came forward. The FBI established a victim assistance program to help people understand their rights and the process for potentially recovering their losses. I attended one of these meetings, sitting in the back of a hotel conference room, listening to people describe how Richard's crimes had affected their lives. Mrs. Chen was there, looking frail but determined. She spoke about how she had trusted Richard with her life savings and how the loss had forced her to move in with her son's family. A man named Frank talked about how he had invested his military pension with Pinnacle and was now working part-time at a grocery store at age 68 to make ends meet. Hearing these stories reinforced my conviction that I had done the right thing. These people deserved justice, and they deserved to know the truth about what had happened to their money. Richard's legal troubles were just beginning. He was charged with multiple federal crimes, including securities fraud, money laundering, and wire fraud. The prosecutors also filed charges related to his attempts to bribe state officials and obstruct the investigation. His attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The FBI had recovered thousands of documents, recorded phone calls, and electronic communications that detailed his criminal activities. The flash drive that had accidentally ended up in my possession was just the tip of the iceberg. The trial began in September, nearly a year after I had first reported Richard's crimes. I was called as a witness and had to testify about my employment at Pinnacle, my discovery of the evidence, and my decision to contact the FBI. It was intimidating to be in the same room as Richard again, but I focused on the victims sitting in the gallery behind me. Richard's defense attorney tried to portray me as a disgruntled former employee who had fabricated evidence out of spite, but the prosecution was able to demonstrate that the evidence was authentic and that Richard's crimes had been ongoing for years before I was even hired. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Expert witnesses testified about the complexity of Richard's fraud scheme. FBI agents described their investigation, and victims told their stories. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Richard was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of over $20 million. The judge noted that his crimes had caused immeasurable harm to hardworking people who had trusted him with their financial futures. But the story didn't end with Richard's conviction. The FBI's investigation had led to the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen assets. Properties, artwork, luxury items, and cash that Richard had purchased with client money were seized and sold. The proceeds were distributed to victims through a court-supervised restitution program. Mrs. Chen got back about 60% of her stolen money, which was enough to allow her to move back into her own apartment. Frank recovered enough to supplement his income and reduce his work hours. Not everyone got back everything they had lost, but the recovery was far better than anyone had initially hoped. As for me, the experience changed my life in ways I never could have anticipated. I became an advocate for financial crime victims, working with nonprofit organizations to help people understand their rights and navigate the complex process of reporting fraud. I also found a new job at a firm that specializes in forensic accounting, where I help investigate financial crimes and recover stolen assets. I often think about that Tuesday morning when I received Richard's termination email. At the time, it felt like the end of the world. I was angry, confused, and scared about my future. But that email, intended to silence me and remove me from the equation, actually set in motion a chain of events that brought justice to dozens of victims and put a dangerous criminal behind bars. The FBI agents who worked on the case told me that financial crimes often go unreported because victims are embarrassed or don't know where to turn for help. They emphasized that my decision to come forward, despite the personal risks, had made all the difference in the outcome. Sometimes people ask me if I regret getting involved, given the stress and complications it brought to my life. The answer is always no. I think about Mrs. Chen's smile when she called to tell me she could afford to move back home. I think about Frank being able to reduce his work hours and spend more time with his grandchildren. I think about the other potential victims who were protected, because Richard's scheme was stopped before it could grow even larger. Getting fired via email was humiliating and painful, but it led me to discover evidence that helped bring down a criminal who had stolen millions from innocent people. In the end, Richard's attempt to silence me backfired spectacularly. Instead of making me disappear, he had unknowingly given me the tools to expose his crimes and ensure that justice was served. Today, Richard is serving his sentence in a federal prison, and his victims are slowly rebuilding their lives. As for me, I've learned that sometimes the worst things that happen to us can lead to opportunities to make a real difference in the world. That's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life.